7. Right? So we're living in this kind of globally, as I mentioned in the previous lecture also, globally networked mobile society. Now, one interesting question that one could possibly raise about it is that what is the relationship between technology and communication? Who is actually deciding that certain technologies become dominant and others are, ignored or just they wither away? Now this is the topic in a lecture in itself, but I just talk about two approaches. One is this idea of technological determinism, that media technologies develop through their own momentum, following an inevitable logic of their own, bringing about other kinds of changes. To think of audio tapes, you can't even buy transistors today. CDs are out, as soon as DVD wouldn't be available. So you might say, well, there is a logic, there is an inevitable logic. Certain technologies are meant to last, certain decades or years, and then they're gone. So this is technological determinism. Of course, this is the more dominant way of thinking about technology. There is also cultural determinism, which suggests that there is no inevitability about it. It's actually human agency which promotes a particular kind of technology and blocks another kind. And not just in media sector, it's in every sector. Think of energy sector, think of how much sunshine we have in the global south, and what could be done with that. If we had thought about this 100 years ago, we wouldn't be dependent on oil from Iran or wherever. Yeah? So again, there's an argument what kind of technology you promote, what you block or ignore. If you think about the amount of money that multinational corporations, especially communication corporations, spend on R&D, research and development, to promote different kind of technologies. In some cases, their budget is bigger than the budget, GDPs of many developing countries. Actually, Marshall McLuhan, who many of you are, whose work you obviously know, he was the first media sociologist who thought about this, the relationship between technology and media. And he came up with this idea of the global village. In the 60s, when satellite communication became a reality, that the US president could pick up his phone and speak directly to the Secretary General of the Communist Party of Soviet Union. And so this is going to change the world, and it did change the world. So this idea of medium is the message, very, very closely associated with his work. So very quickly, let me go through what are the technological changes in recent decades. We're living in an age of multimedia, of course. Previously distinct media have converged. It's a mobile communication environment. Mobility is increasingly the reality across the world and growing very, very rapidly. Interactivity is part of the digital age in which we live. Yeah. Now, this could be complicated also because, for instance, in news media context, you see, for example, CNN or BBC or other major networks, you would see somebody's tweet or somebody's telephone call being shown on screen. The X person says Y, and then somebody else says something else. Now, there is human agency involved in that, in the sense that they might be getting 500 calls, so they pick 2 or 3. Similarly, they get 800 tweets and they pick 2 or 3. So interactivity is also managed. Yeah? But the fact that there is that potential now for people to instantly react to any news item or any event is an interesting part of technological change. Tremendous amount of data. I mean, this, again, I don't need to labor this point, we all know it. But I'm of a generation when if you had an attachment on your email, and if it was a photograph, let alone a video, it used to take a long time to download. So you will click and then you'll go and have a coffee and come back and still it is downloading, right? This may sound unrealistic to younger generation, but this happened. And I'm talking about the UK, not in this country, right? So now if you don't download a movie in 30 seconds, you start hitting people, right? Yeah? So this extraordinary amount of data and the speed with which it's delivered is unprecedented in human history. And remember, internet still is a child. It's crawling, it's not even walking yet. Just imagine when it's a big grown-up man. Another 10 years. Yeah? Think in human terms, right? Teenager, a lot of power. Typical day in the life of the internet. This is from World Development Report of the World Bank, 2016. So obviously, a lot of this data is old. But it gives you a sense of the scale. So 207 billion emails every day. 8.8 billion YouTube videos watched every day, etc. If you had a later report, I'm sure it's being compiled, the figure will be even higher, obviously. And also because large population countries like India, like China, like Brazil, like Indonesia, they are increasingly getting online, especially through mobile internet, and this data is growing by leaps and bounds. What are the features of this networked mobile media world that we inhabit? Strong consumer orientation, mobility, and personalization of media. So we are increasingly consumers. We are not citizens. Yeah? We consume things. And we have our very personalized input of data, of media. We choose what we want to watch or listen or read. Also has the danger that then we ghettoize. It's kind of echo chamber. We are only talking to people who talk like us or about things that interest us. So you are interested in a particular film star or a particular country or a particular commodity, you get that material sent to you on your mobile phone. The rest of the world doesn't matter to you. Interactive media, of course, I made this point earlier also, especially so in social media. And just, I mentioned the case of journalism, but interactivity is also at a personal level. You're having a meal somewhere in a restaurant, it's normal now, you take a picture and you send it to your friends. Yeah? And then they comment. Immediacy and continual updates. particularly relevant in the context of journalism. They used to say in journalism, I've worked in the news agencies, so I know that pressure of deadlines is much stronger than, this was before 24/7 television news, so now, and Twitter, etc. But it's now not updates every minute, but updates every second, especially if you're dealing with financial information. 3 seconds delay and somebody else has moved a lot of money from X to Y, and some stocks have gone down, somebody is having a party in Peru or whatever. There's also extraordinary amount of information available today from a large variety of sources. So as a professor, I feel that in my class I say something and the student will just Google and say, no, actually the date was this, you got it wrong, and I'll correct it. I'm sorry, yeah, good. So huge range of information is available at the click of a button. And you don't need to just depend on one media source. There is, as I said yesterday in the lecture on news media, in the international news media space itself, almost all major powers, with the honorable exception of India, have a voice in English language. So you want to find out what's happening on what happened in Helsinki in the US-Russian summit. You can read the French, the German, the Russian, the American, the British, the Turkish. I could go on. Within 5 minutes, you can read all that. And yet, there is a tendency to just read the headlines. Just the cursory engagement with the subject, rather than reading the text, you read the headline. Even though this incredible amount of high quality information is accessible so easily. But it is also quite significantly, this whole ecology of communication affected journalism. To the extent that increasingly, people, when you talk about journalism, the digital is just central to that almost. Although radio exists, newspapers are printed, in fact, in parts of Asia, in China, in India, and some other Asian countries, newspaper circulation is still growing in absolute numbers, unlike in Western Europe or United States, where newspaper circulation is declining very rapidly. Well-established newspapers like the Chicago Tribune, like the Guardian in London, are losing huge revenue and audience and advertising, as a result. But increasingly, their trend is to go digital, and this is maybe it's what I said earlier, a technological deterministic view that there's no option, you have to go digital. But in that space, you also have increasing presence of people who are not traditional journalists. Yeah, this whole idea of blogging. There's a fantastic book which came out a couple of years ago, and blogging in Iran is called Blogistan. And in a country where the media system is so directly controlled by the state, blogs create a space where alternative discourses shape and influence debates. Also, a kind of subjective journalism, advocacy journalism, issue-oriented journalism, less bothered with the conventions of objectivity. I say conventions of objectivity, but objectivity is a complex concept itself. You see a lot of that on web-based journalism, because it gives you greater space. You can write a longer piece, you can do a multimedia production, you can have pictures, sounds, data, etc., etc., and you are not necessarily influenced by the ownership structure of particular news organization. So you can afford to be more subjective. You can afford to be more, advocacy oriented. News from below. Traditionally, news has come from above. One of the charms of journalism is the power it gives you as a journalist to rub shoulders with rich and famous, to be part of the elite. And now increasingly there is this tendency of journalism from below. And I don't want to idealize it, but it is happening, and it is an interesting dimension of the internet's relation with journalism. I mentioned YouTube effect yesterday in my lecture. I don't know how familiar you are with that. You've heard this expression before, I'm sure, but the origin of this phrase, YouTube effect, does anybody know? This was a piece written in the journal Foreign Policy by its editor. I think 2005, or don't know exactly, I don't remember exactly, but it's around that time. And it mentioned an event that happened on the border in China and Tibet, and there were some Chinese Tibetans actually trying to cross over to Nepal and to India, and they were shot by the Chinese border guards. And some mountaineering group was around there. They filmed it and they sent it to somebody in New York. They put it on YouTube, and suddenly it became an international story. And this person, the journal art editors, coined this phrase. This is YouTube effect. And YouTube wasn't that big then as it is today. And today YouTube is so big that, as I was saying yesterday, in certain conflicts, Syria particularly, it is almost integral part of the whole propaganda debate. In more recent years, especially since 2016 US election, this phrase fake news has become very popular. And it's also a kind of indication of American hegemony of both intellectual discourse and media discourse, that fake news has become a global phrase. Yeah? I was recently at a conference in the US, and some very distinguished American professors said to me, what do you think of fake news? Because there was a lot of fake news papers in that conference. So I said, I have a slightly different take on it, because there is a whole fake discourse which has been created for many, many decades, like Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, that Saddam Hussein was in bed with Al-Qaeda. They're like blatant lies. And they were not just one story, one news report. They were part of a discourse which was a false discourse. And it's one of many examples. So obviously this was not received very well, but it doesn't matter. I make my point. So, but it's interesting that fake news as a phenomena has been is seen as the worst thing that has happened to journalism. Actually, there are many more serious problems, but it is certainly an issue, and I'll say more about that in a minute. But on the plus side, internet is also seen as the global public sphere. A space within which global public opinion can be shaped. And of course, communication, journalism is a very important part of that process, because somebody has to contribute to that debate, yeah? And if a lot of people from different parts of the world are engaging, and they have the connectivity, they have the networks, they can create and if you think about whether it's about the Me Too phenomena, or if you think about environmental protection, if you think about dealing with migration, refugees, etc., or think of the this whole collaborative projects of investigative journalism to expose so many, you know, yes, again, that's a case of creating a space where issues of global importance can be articulated and perhaps impact policy on that. But I'll go back to fake news and talk about the role of Facebook in this, because Facebook has been in the news for a lot lately. This is a study that was published by BuzzFeed, which is an online portal in US and also has other regional units. This looks at the top 5 fake news stories which were circulating on social media leading up to the 2016 election in the United States. And as the chart shows, there were more people engaging with that discourse, 8.7 million, as against 7 million people who were getting this information from mainstream media. And this is just one of many studies that we've done. There's been a much longer academic study done on this in terms of how social media, and specifically fake news, Facebook was used to generate stories which were obviously concocted based on very, very direct political for very direct political reasons, and there also talks about various parties involved in it, including overseas parties. To the extent that Facebook then started a year later a project, the News Literacy Project they called it, to ensure that fake news is not circulating on the world's largest social media, which has 2 billion people or thereabouts as members. And there have been similar measures taken by many other countries in France, in Scandinavia, in UK, elsewhere, to try to check the menace of fake news. The most recent one I could find was this campaign in Malaysia, where there are now organizations, they're saying, if you find something which is fake, just tell us, we will then follow it up, go to the authorities, etc. And again, this connectivity, the social, media connectivity, and the instant communication that it entails, and this huge amount of data it can, send around the world within seconds. It's all related to that, and nobody has time to check the authenticity of the content or the source of the content. And the more sensationalist it is, more likely to be distributed. And then somebody is making money in that bargain. As long as you are on social media, you're actually paying for it without realizing. There's also an increasing presence of content which is not textual, which is actually visual. Visuals travel more easily, and if you've seen something, say, well, this must be true because this is a video, I saw a video, so it can't be, concocted or manufactured. I mentioned previously in the lecture, I wrote a book on infotainment 10 years ago. It was on television news. And I'm thinking of a book that I want to write about, I'm going to call Infotainment 2.0, which is about what kind of content actually travels through social media. And this is the data from industry data recently. So if you look at the video, the dark blue one, the bottom one, this is in petabytes. That's a huge amount of data. And it's only likely to grow further as more and more people join the, um, the world of the social media and the internet. So, what are the implications of this kind of connectivity and this potential danger of fake news, etc.? One is obviously the question of accuracy. You know, the Time magazine had a cover story last year. It was called "The Post-Truth World." Yeah, that's another Americanism which has been globalized.
Or the Time cover in which we saw the girl with Trump.
Yes. Oh, more recent.
The girl wasn't really
that's right.
separated from the
Yes, the Mexican story. Yeah. So, mass media has traditionally been criticized for not being accurate. Yeah. With social media, because as I say, there's no time. Truth seldom emerges in a hurry. There's no time to check. Those of you who worked in the media industry would appreciate that there used to be a structure. The reporter will file the story, the chief reporter will look at it, then the sub-editor will look at it, another editor will look at it, a third, fourth person, before it is printed before it's sent out by the news agency. Then the newspaper also would look at it, there's a sub-editor there. So it's gone through 4, 5, 6 gatekeepers. And they would check. The big newspapers have, departments with the researchers whose job is to check facts. So today, you can have this millions of messages, videos traveling around the world without authentication. So, journalism generally had, by and large, quality journalism had factual accuracy. If Reuters is saying so many people died in a conflict, you tend to believe it because they have done their research. You might have issues about the contextual accuracy. What is the context of that conflict? There might be politics involved. Yeah? But with social media, it's the basic factual information can be wrong and is wrong in many cases. Portability of technology today, portable satellite transmitters defy censorship. So again, this is for younger generation. They won't appreciate it as much as people of certain other generation. It used to be impossible to send data across national boundaries. It cost a lot of money, and you have to go through telegraph office and send a telex. And it used to go. Today, you can be in a middle of a jungle, and you have the satellite-enabled phone. You can send stories within seconds. They've gone to, they've gone viral almost. Yeah. If you're freelance, otherwise you send it to a news organization, it's sent across, and that works as a serious threat to censorship regimes, both in democracies, but even in more controlled societies. Copyright and intellectual property rights. There are numerous cases where in the digital space people cannibalize content, they copy and then the copy of copy, etc., without bothering with any intellectual property, any copyright. And there are instances where journalists have just, copied a piece published in the New York Times. It happened, I don't want to name people, it happened in many instances where actually then some younger journalists found out it's actually a copy from this piece published in the New York Times. We've just taken a few paras out of it. So that's also a serious concern in terms of intellectual property. And then, of course, the question of access. It is, of course, as of today, I think half the population of the world is online. That means half is not online. So 3.5 billion people are not online even today. Of course, it's the most, the growth has been phenomenal. No other media in history has grown so fast as the internet. But still, half the world's population is not um, connected, but also the gaps within nations based on class, on gender, on ethnicity. These are quite strong. I mean, India is a case in point. So government has this big Digital India program where both the domestic industry and transnational industry and a very pro-business government is very keen to bring digital connectivity to the last village in the country. But there are so many barriers, social, historical, technological, infrastructural, etc. And this is a story you see repeated in many, many other developing countries. Even in more advanced nations, there are gaps based on ethnicity, for instance, gender, for instance. But at the same time, there's also huge money to be made in this space. It's no coincidence the most commonly used domain name is .com, most dominant obviously. And also, as you see the other chart, advertising spend on the internet is growing very rapidly, which essentially, and search is the biggest revenue earner, and of course, Google dominates that arena. There's also, more recently this come into public domain, but has been a problem for a long time, which is the problem with personal data, data harvesting, data mining, and data selling. This is an example of how many accounts have been stolen, social media accounts, and some key examples all the way from 2014. The biggest then was in the Yahoo, which 500 million accounts were compromised. Now these are recorded cases of breaches of private data. There are many more which are not recorded. And as more and more people get online and they do more and more activity in a digital space, whether it's a financial transaction or personal communication or journalism or political activity, whatever, this is a huge area as researchers, I mean, and scholars. In India, there is actually very little work on it. The policy regime is also not quite kind of clear about what should be the regulatory structure. I mean, it's difficult, even in more advanced societies, it's not been worked out. But there is an urgent need in India where so many more people are getting onto the digital superhighway, and they need to be told about how to protect their rights. The most striking case of this was obviously the celebrated Cambridge Analytica case, where a political communication agency essentially worked with Facebook, and as you see in this chart, many countries from United States to Canada to India to Brazil to Australia, they were involved. Their Facebook accounts were basically traded. Mr. Zuckerberg defended himself both in the UK Parliamentary Committee, but also in the US and elsewhere. And they wrote a very copious statement saying that we will be careful. But this is just, in my view, this is just the this top of the surface. There's a lot more happening, and it's not just Facebook, by the way. There are many other those media companies and social media companies whose business model is based on essentially dealing with data. So I think as consumers, as scholars, we need to be thinking about it more carefully. In terms of how the academic world has seen this, I mean, there's a lot of literature. I don't have time to go into there. I'll just pick two cases here with contrasting positions. The Net Delusion is a very widely cited book, which essentially critiques this idea of empowerment and, you know, the kind of dominant discourse about internet and about social media. How not to liberate the world. So the argument is actually we are being enslaved, not liberated by digital technology. And a contrasting position that you see in the other book, which again was widely cited, a popular book, where the theme is of empowerment, that information is power, this is now being democratized and distributed around the world, and that's going to be a good thing for everybody concerned. Although, as I've been repeatedly saying, that, you know, this whole digital space was not just created by some divine intervention. There is human agency involved. There is an infrastructure for this. It's a software for it, which is still largely controlled by the United States. And just to remind you of this, this is a map which shows the cable systems. Right? So much of our data travels by undersea cables. And those of you who have done history would remember that British Empire had the largest cable networks in 19th century, and that's what gave Britain the advantage over other European powers. And as the First World War ended, the first thing Americans and British wanted to do was to take over all the German undersea cables, because it's not just about news, it's also about commodity prices, communication, etc. It's very, very important. And now it's happening, different era, but look at who are the big players: Facebook, Google, and Microsoft, all American companies. So not just that they are providing you a platform to enjoy yourself, to send pictures of dancing cats, whatever, but they also own the infrastructure through which these messages are traveling. Some are already in place, others are under construction. But at the same time, while this is happening, the usage of internet has changed, as I mentioned also in the very first lecture. So this is the latest available data. The largest number of users are in Asia, obviously, more than 2 billion. If you just think of India and China, forget about rest of Asia, that's a huge proportion of the world's population. But the penetration rate, if you look at this, the other chart, is still 48%. Just look at India. 60%, 60+% are not online. In China also, I think it's about 55% as of today, which are not offline, online. So the majority are not online. As against North America, where 95% are already online. So the potential growth is also going to come from places like India, China, Indonesia, Brazil, etc. Now, as I promised at the beginning, I want to also look at how when we think about internet in a more international context. In other words, how do we internationalize internet? As you all know, internet has its history in the United States. It was part of a defense establishment. It was created to deal with the security threat during the Cold War, that in case there's a nuclear attack on, on the United States, they should have a communication network, right? And then it went to universities, and only in the 1990s it was privatized and then globalized. So that defense security dimension is extremely important. But what is new in the last 30 years is the commercial dimension, and it's become so very important. But that dimension is largely defined by big American companies. Right? The only difference that has been made in recent years to that domination is what's happening in the largest internet in the world, which is in China. And I want to share with you some of the changes that have taken place there, which in my view have global implications. So one is this thing called BAT, okay? Baidu, Tencent, and Alibaba. This is from Wall Street Journal. Now these are digital conglomerates. They have investment in various domains, both